In my mind, there are three likely meanings to how exactly Christ is a slave here in the Philippians Christ hymn. The first option is that it's a poetic extension of becoming human. The first stanza is all about the descent from heaven to earth, and the reference to slave is there to show us exactly how far this fall was. The second option is that it's a reference to the crucifixion, as death by crucifixion was an execution frequently used for slaves. The third option is that this is a poem, and so it's not either or, it's both and. So it's a reference to the incarnation and his crucifixion. If we were going to argue for the first option, a reference to the incarnation and not just the crucifixion, you only have to look at where this line falls in the hymn. It's in the section that's all about Jesus leaving heaven, emptying himself of everything that is divine and becoming human. In fact, taking on the form of a slave is the first thing that the hymn points to after he empties himself. The hymn says that he took the form of a slave. It says he was born in human likeness and found in human form. If it was a reference to the cross, then wouldn't that come after the being found in human form? Wouldn't it be form of God, form of human, form of slave? Its position in the hymn suggests pretty clearly that it's talking about Jesus's emptied self, no longer in the form of God. And when Jesus is a husk of his former self, there he is like a slave. And what is a slave if not obedient to his Lord? The hymn specifically says that Jesus is obedient to God, following the divine plan. That too might just symbolically, metaphorically render Jesus as the slave who is obedient to his master and emptied of anything else. So, option one, right? Well, here's the thing. Crucifixion really was the preferred method of torture and execution of runaway slaves. Under Roman law, a Roman citizen was forbidden to be crucified. It was only foreigners and slaves. If you remember, they wanted to crucify St. Paul, but then the Romans were reminded that he was a citizen. So crucifixion wasn't an option. Runaway slaves, in particular, were crucified publicly to quite obviously ward off any other slaves from thinking about running away from their masters. When an ancient person saw a crucified body, they would have immediately thought, oh, it was a slave. To say that Christ went from the form of God to the form of a slave is a way to render the life and death of Jesus in a single line. Thus, the word slave here is a reference to the manner of his death. And then the born in human likeness and found in human form comes afterwards as a modifier. After the quick form of God, form of a slave, human likeness and human form is a way to go back and discuss the incarnation in some more detail. We might even change up the punctuation a bit in the poem. Remember, ancient Greek had no punctuation, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, period. Then the next thought, being born in human likeness and being found in human form, he humbled himself. You see, option two, right? It's obvious. Or perhaps it's a bit of both. Perhaps the poetry here is just opaque enough for slave to reference both Christ's humanity and his death. This isn't a theological or philosophical text meant for trained rhetoricians to pore over word by word. It's a hymn meant to be sung during worship. But wherever you fall on this, whatever you think slave means here exactly, we should just marvel for a moment that this text references Jesus as a slave. Over the past few weeks, we might have been alerted for the first time to the slave and master metaphor as a way to talk about God as the master and us as the slaves. But here, Christ is identified as a slave. It really is something, right? Going back to the question we've asked a few times in this course, what would the slaves in the church of Philippi thought of when they heard this letter read? That Christ, their Lord and Master, was also a slave, like them. If this was indeed a hymn that the early Christians knew and sang in worship, how would the Christian slaves in the congregation have felt when they heard these words? In the 2nd century, we start seeing some of the church fathers talk about the incredible importance of the incarnation. For Jesus to have saved us, he had to be human like us. And for Jesus to save us, he also had to be God. One of the phrases that starts to be used in the 2nd century is that which is not assumed cannot be saved. Meaning if Jesus didn't become human, then he couldn't save us humans. For this hymn to state that Christ took on the form of a slave, the human beings on the lowest rungs of the social and legal hierarchy in ancient Roman society, means that there is no one in all of humanity that is outside the saving power of God in Christ. Even slaves, that which is not assumed cannot be saved. And when Jesus comes and empties himself of everything, he assumes the mantle of the lowest of the low, that all of us might, by faith, rise in glory with him.